on our YouTube channel. I think also by way of just like a nice little virtual icebreaker, if you could let us know where you're joining us in from in the chat box, that's always really great to see which cities, which regions, or even which countries are being represented with us today. So just a reminder in the chat box, if you can select to address all panelists and attendees, that would be wonderful so that everyone can see each other's comments. Wow, Vermont, nice. Welcome. Nice, I'm seeing San Diego, thank you. I'm originally from SoCal, so I'm glad to see representation. Hello, New York. Hello, Bay Area. All right, thank you so much for continuing to share out. And we have an hour of program prepared for you today, and it's not a lot of time. I feel like we're actually gonna have so much material that we're gonna be a little constrained about our time. So I would like to get started with my introduction. My name is Akemi Chan Imai, and I want to welcome you all officially to OACC's first program of 2021. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. It really means a lot to have all of you join us at this time. A little bit about Oakland Asian Cultural Center. Our mission is to build vibrant communities through API arts and cultural programs that foster intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogue, understanding, collaboration, and social justice. And while we are, seeing participants from all across the nation join us today, we wanted to also acknowledge that ourselves as OACC staff, this program is being generated and broadcast from Ohlone land. We want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples that really stewarded the land that we are currently working in. And so I would like to invite, if you have the means to, look into more about the Indigenous peoples of your area, there's a really great website that I found to be very helpful as a starting point called the Native Lands CA. So if Rachel, you can pop that in real quick. I would encourage everyone to reach out and support your local Indigenous peoples. Just some really quick housekeeping. Please note that we are recording and simultaneously live streaming this session in our YouTube channel. So as a default, we are keeping audience muted just for the quality, and then we'll see later in the Q&A if we have time and if there's interest to maybe unmute a few folks if you have longer form questions or comments for our speakers. And of course, as we are already so great at doing, please feel free to use the chat box to drop in questions and comments as well. We also have the Q&A function in the menu of the Zoom if you'd like to submit that way. And now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's featured speakers and authors, Akemi Johnson and Shawna Yang Ryan. I just wanted to briefly set up a short bio to introduce them. Akemi Johnson is the author of Night in the American Village, Women in the Shadow of the U.S. Military Bases in Okinawa. This book was shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. Akemi has been the recipient of a Fulbright grant to Japan, a Pushcart Prize nomination, and the James D. Phelan Award from the San Francisco Foundation. And following her is another wonderful individual, Shawna Yang Ryan, who is a former Fulbright scholar and the author of Water Ghosts and Green Island. She is the director of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and her work has received the Association for Asian American Studies Best Book Award in Creative Writing, the Elliott Cades Emerging Writer Award, and an American Book Award. And we are also posting links so that you can directly find their books. They are available for purchase online, and we're going to also post that link in the chat box for you. So without further ado, I wanted to call up Akemi, if you can turn on your video and take us away.
Hi, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's here today with us. I'm really grateful to the Oakland Asian Cultural Center for hosting this event, and I'm really happy to be here with Shauna, whose work I've admired for a long time. I love both her novels, and so I hope you check them out if you haven't already. So I'm going to start by talking a bit generally about Okinawa for those of you who might not know as much about the place, and then I'm going to go into some of my research there. And I'm going to show some images as well. Okay, so this is Okinawa if you don't know. So it's that small arc of islands in the bottom center of this map. You can see, their size and how far away they are from mainland Japan. They're very close to Taiwan and China. And what's important to understand about Okinawa in terms of today's discussion is that Okinawa has experienced the imperialism of both Japan and the United States. And so I'm going to briefly talk about that history. Before Okinawa was a part of Japan, it was an independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom. Its people were traders. They were the middlemen in the trade of luxury goods across Asia. So this work put them in contact with many different peoples and cultures in the region. And the traditional Ryukyuan culture reflects these different Asian influences. Then in 1879, Japan overthrew the king of the Ryukyus. This is the royal castle here, and annexed the islands as a prefecture. After that, Okinawans were pressured to assimilate and lose their indigenous culture and languages to become quote unquote Japanese. Then came World War II. In the spring of 1945, the United States military invaded Okinawa. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, with high casualties among American and Japanese troops. But the highest loss of life was among Okinawan civilians, with as many as 1 in 3 Okinawans dying during that battle. After the victory of the Allies, the US occupied Japan until 1952, but stayed 20 years longer in Okinawa until 1972. And so in the shorter occupation of mainland Japan, the United States pursued an agenda of demilitarization and democratization and supervised the drafting of Japan's peace constitution. In the 27-year-long occupation of Okinawa, Okinawans were not citizens of Japan or the United States. They lacked constitutional rights and participated in only a sham democracy. It was during this time, the US occupation, when the US forcibly removed many Okinawans from their land and bulldozed their homes to build military bases. Today, Okinawa has one of the highest concentrations of American bases overseas. About 1 in 8 US service members who are stationed abroad are in Okinawa. And this is a map of the main island of Okinawa, and you can see how many bases there are and how much space they take up. So listening to this short history, right, you can see that Okinawans experienced a lot of suffering because of the United States and Japan. They lost much of their culture, their languages, their rights, their lands, their homes. Some even lost their lives. And in thinking today too about the current situation, I think if Americans do hear any news from Okinawa, and I think we often don't hear any news in the United States, it's usually also about victimization. We hear about how Okinawans continue to suffer because of the heavy US military presence in Okinawa. One of the main narratives we hear is about the sexual assault of Okinawan women and girls by US servicemen. Every so often, there's a particularly heinous crime that captures international attention, and this crime becomes a kind of metaphor for the larger situation. So the rape of Okinawa by the United States and Japan. There's indeed a long history of sexual assault by US service members in Okinawa, which I chronicle in my book. The majority of these crimes have been unreported, and so it's a much larger and more serious issue than many people realize. But in writing my book, I didn't want to stop at this one narrative. My book explores Okinawans' decades-long relationship with the US military, and without discounting the very serious issue of sexual assault, I wanted to move beyond a discussion of Okinawan victimhood. I wanted to show how, even facing this dual imperialism, Okinawans have agency. They are actors in this story. And with their actions, some help the US military bases remain, and others resist the bases. I decided to focus on women because they arguably are the most entangled with the bases. They're the ones more likely to date and marry US service members, to work in the entertainment areas around the bases, and to be the targets of sexual assault. So you might be wondering, given this difficult history, why would any Okinawans want to help the bases stay in their islands? There used to be strong economic reasons for that. Many Okinawans used to rely on the bases for their livelihoods. Today, though, economists estimate the bases account for only about 5% of the local economy. So the reasons are often less financial and more personal. What I found is that the lived experience of these bases can be very intimate. Over the years, the military presence has become a part of people's everyday reality, their families, their identities, and this helps the military have staying power. Also, to my surprise, I found some women in Okinawa found ways to use the bases to their advantage to get something that they wanted. So my book is organized around 11 women who I profile, some who resist the bases and some who choose to coexist with them. And I'm going to briefly tell you about 3 of them now. Eve was a 29-year-old Okinawan receptionist who didn't speak much English, but she dated only American servicemen. As you can maybe imagine, the language and cultural barrier and transitory nature of the military meant she faced a lot of challenges in these relationships, but she was determined, and she would spend her weekends going to hip hop clubs in areas like this here, looking for a US serviceman to marry. What I found in spending time with women like Eve was that, these dating preferences were as much about a way of life as about finding a man. Women who only dated Americans formed a kind of subculture in Okinawa, and the women were often known for the way they looked and acted more American, and this could mean more overtly sexy than other Okinawan women, more outspoken, less concerned with what others think. In this way, Eve and other women were using the base presence and the kind of American spaces that they create to reinvent themselves and assert parts of their identity that otherwise might have remained hidden. They were using the bases to get something that they wanted. And in this case, that was an escape from traditional Japanese gender roles. Arisa was another woman who I profiled. She was an Okinawan woman who grew up outside of this base here in the photo. This is Kadena Air Force Base. It's the largest US Air Force base in all of Asia. And Okinawans who live near this base, you can kind of see the names on this map, often complain about the loud noise of the aircraft. Those are 2 runways, those long lines on the base. the dangers of living so close to these runways, the threat of accidents happening. But when Arisa told me her memories of growing up outside of this base, she told me about a game that she played with her dad. She said her dad would challenge her and her little sister to walk all the way around this base. So the three of them would spend 4 or 5 hours walking all the way around Kadena. And I was really interested in why her dad would do this. She told me that her parents were politically against the bases. And so I thought maybe her dad was trying to show her, viscerally how much land this base took up and how unjust that was. But in any case, this was a game that Arisa remembered positively, and it was like an adventure to her. She went on to marry a US serviceman and become someone who no longer had to circle that base, but could, unlike most Okinawans, cross the fence and go on the base. When I met Arisa, she said she was happy with her life choices, but she felt some internal tension about the base issue. She felt like her spirit was Okinawan, and she believed there needed to be a reduction of US bases in Okinawa, but she felt like she could never get involved in the anti-base movement because her husband worked on base. And now her parents too, who used to protest the bases, felt more ambivalent. For this family, the US military had become not just a part of their neighborhood, as you can see, but also a part of their family. And that caused them to accept it, even though they had issues with it. Okinawans do choose to resist the US military presence. This woman in the pink shirt here is Chie. She's an Okinawan anti-base activist who I profile in my book. Like Arisa, Chie had some personal connections to the bases. 2 of Chie's nieces had married American servicemen. But while for Arisa's family, this intimate connection to the bases stifled their activism, it didn't for Chie. Chie was very dedicated to the anti-base movement. And what motivated Chie was the legacy of the Battle of Okinawa, which I mentioned, and which her parents survived. Chie wanted to demilitarize Okinawa and prevent it from being linked to a war like that ever again. When I spent time with Chie, she and a group of others were working to protest a new US military base being built in Okinawa in the town of Henoko. This is the location of that new base. I got to visit it. It really is a gorgeous spot. It's this biologically diverse bay filled with endangered and endemic species. But the plan is to fill in part of this bay with rock, sand, and gravel and build a giant new military base. So what Chie and others would do was go out on kayaks into this bay. This is Chie here, and try to physically stop or slow the construction from happening. It was dangerous work. They told me they had been injured, feared for their lives, but they felt so strongly about it, they continued to do it. There are many other protesters at this site on land. So outside of the gates to this site, Okinawans have been holding a sit-in for many years. They're trying to block the construction trucks from coming on base. Many of these activists are elderly. They lived through that war that I talked about, the Battle of Okinawa. And like Chie, that's what motivated a lot of them. This man here told me he lost his brother in World War II, and that's partly why he was out there protesting. Here are a few more images from that site. So this situation is still going on today. Okinawan people have voted to say they don't want this base. It's been discovered that there are real engineering issues with building this base, but the Japanese government and the American government has ignored all of this, and construction crews have started dumping sand and gravel into the water. So I think you can see the situation in 2 ways. One, Okinawans have been protesting this new base for decades, and both on the ground here in these images and through local government. but despite all their efforts, they haven't succeeded in stopping it. On the other hand, they have succeeded in significantly slowing down this project and exposing it as kind of a disaster. This base was originally supposed to be finished in 2014 and cost $3.3 billion. Now the Japanese government estimates it will take at least 12 more years to complete and cost at least $9.6 billion. Recently, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a US think tank, said it appears unlikely that this base will ever be completed. So to wrap it up, Okinawans aren't just victims in this geopolitical game. They are players, and they have the agency to help the bases remain or to resist them. And I'm going to stop right there, and would love to hear your questions after we hear from Shawna Yang Ryan, who is coming up next.
Thank you, Akemi, and thank you all for being here today. And I'm glad that this dialogue was able to be opened up. I'm going to give first a brief introduction to Taiwan and talk about my engagement with Taiwan, particularly with my novel, and then a little bit about imperialism and Taiwan and language. Though this book required me to engage with quite a bit of history and political history, I want to reiterate that I'm a novelist, not a historian, so I bring a fiction writer's view to the discussion. So Taiwan is a collection of islands off the east coast of China. It's about 100 miles across the strait from Fujian province. It's about 400 miles from Okinawa. The main island is known as Taiwan, and it's small. It's about 245 miles long and 89 miles wide, and it has a population equal to Australia's, though, a little over 23 million people. And the population is multicultural, including Taiwanese and Hakka, and 16 officially recognized indigenous groups. Taiwan was a colony of Japan for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. And then at the end of World War II, the government of the Republic of China, also known as the Chinese Nationalists or the Kuomintang, I'm going to refer to them as the KMT, they took control of the island. In 1947, there was a protest by the Taiwanese against the KMT rulers, resulting in a government-led massacre called the 228 Massacre, in which thousands of people were murdered and arrested. This led to martial law and a period called the White Terror, in which the opposition to the KMT were imprisoned or executed, and the victims of the White Terror numbered in the tens of thousands. In 1949, after the KMT were defeated by the Chinese communists in the Chinese Civil War, 2 million Chinese fled to Taiwan to establish a government in exile. They intended to regroup and eventually, quote unquote, retake the mainland. And in order to get buy-in to this project, they began teaching China's history as Taiwan's history, and they enforced Mandarin language use. So in short, this was a massive propaganda campaign to convince the Taiwanese that they were Chinese. Obviously, the KMT never did retake China from the communists, and after nearly 4 decades, martial law was finally lifted in 1987, and Taiwan is now a democracy. Taiwan is often mistaken by Americans, in my personal experience, for Thailand or China. My work with Taiwan has been shaped by encountering a lot of misunderstanding about what Taiwan is in American discourse and in the American media. One contentious word is, quote unquote, reunification, which is often used to describe Taiwan's relationship with China, though, like I mentioned, Taiwan has never been a part of the PRC. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this language in a bit. So Taiwan most recently has received more positive media attention, and I just wanted to mention this because they've had an incredibly agile response to the pandemic. They had only 7 deaths, and they had no community spread for 8 months. It helps that their vice president is an epidemiologist. And their president, she's this pragmatic, low-key, and highly capable woman, Tsai Ing-wen. She's also received a lot of praise recently. So my engagement with Taiwan, and in fact, my life, is tied to US imperialism in the Pacific. My father was stationed in Taiwan in the early 70s as a member of the US military during the Vietnam War. And that's where he met my mother, who was born in Taiwan and grew up there. My family has been in Taiwan for 70 years. They were part of the wave of the Chinese who fled to Taiwan in 1949. After I graduated from college, I went to Taiwan for 15 months, and my mother had shared almost no history about Taiwan with me, apart from the fact that her parents had come fleeing from the Chinese communists. And so everything else I learned from the Lonely Planet guide that I read on the plane ride to Taipei. And of course, the best way to learn about a place is to be in the place. So during that year, Taiwan's history came to me in bits and pieces, and it transformed my view of Taiwan as I spent time with my family and traveled around the country. And then after graduate school, I returned to Taiwan for 3 more years to spend time researching my novel. Even though I read a lot about Taiwan's history, in writing my novel, I struggled through shaping a coherent narrative that made sense, like a narrative that could draw together the threads of colonialism, authoritarianism, and democracy that shaped Taiwan. I had to reconcile nostalgia that people expressed in their interviews for the Japanese period with what I had read of the historic brutality of the Japanese colonial period. I had to reconcile the strong thread of activism among the people who had fought for the democratic movement with the silence enforced by the KMT government during their authoritarian rule. And I didn't know at the time of any other novels that were written in English about the 20th century history of Taiwan. So I kind of felt like I was building a bridge as I crossed the river. So a little bit about my novel. My novel Green Island follows one family in Taiwan through 60 years of history, starting from the 1947 massacre through martial law to the democratic era. It's the story of a family surviving under martial law after the father is arrested for protesting the government. And for 11 years, they don't know what's happened to the father. And then he returns home, having spent this time in prison, a changed man, and his changes affect the family. It's narrated by the youngest daughter. It follows her life. She then marries a graduate student, a Taiwanese graduate student in the US who is involved in the democratic movement. And ultimately, she's placed in a position where she has to choose between loyalty to her family or complicity with the KMT government. And then the book ends during the SARS coronavirus outbreak in 2003, which I was in Taiwan for. So in researching my novel, I found the following quote by Harvard sinologist Paul Cohen very resonant. Stories often do more to shape the community's sense of what happened in the past than historians' careful reconstructive efforts. People told me their stories and their memories, and I tried to stitch together a novel that would hopefully come alive for its readers. And sometimes what felt more true to people's memories diverged from what was historically accurate, and I tried to balance a line between the two. And I also wanted a story that would feel more authentic to Taiwanese readers in particular. And after many drafts, all in the third person and focusing on the male characters, I decided to narrate the story from the point of view of a Taiwanese woman, because I realized that a lot of the history I'd read focused on what had happened to the men, which was horrible. And like I mentioned, the massive arrests and executions. But the missing part of the story that I wasn't getting a lot of the time through the histories I was reading was the story of the women who were left behind to pick up the pieces, who were the survivors and who kept life going in Taiwanese society. So what were the stories of the widows, the daughters, and the mothers left behind? And I felt that the omission in a way discounted their experiences and their contributions and their trauma. So I really wanted to center the novel on them. And a novel, of course, must be grounded in people. Like geopolitics is such a large looming word. How do you even capture that in the space of a sentence or a chapter or in a novel? So the story must be embodied in the physical, in a character's experiences. And that's what I tried to do. But a little bit about the language of imperialism. So Taiwan lives in the shadow of at least 3 strains of imperialism and / colonialism: Japan, the US, and China. And by imperialism, I don't just mean hard power and military power, but also soft power, cultural imperialism. And in the novel, we see all these 3 strains, from the lingering cultural artifacts of the Japanese era to the American military station there in the 60s and 70s, to China's preventing Taiwan from joining the WHO during the SARS outbreak. America is so deeply implicated into Taiwan's modern history. During the Cold War, the fear of communism was so great that the US was willing to tolerate Chiang Kai-shek's dictatorship in Taiwan instead. And Taiwan was even referred to as America's quote unquote battleship in the Pacific. Now, Taiwan today is still webbed into these Cold War politics, often posited as not much more than a thorn in the relationship between the US and China. So one prominent example is when Trump had a phone call with President Tsai after his election. These were some of the headlines. Trump's phone call to Taiwan's leader risks China tensions. The Taiwan call was no courtesy. Donald Trump means to wreck US-China relations. Trump's call to Taiwan shows China he's not a pushover. So what I see happening with Taiwan today is what I think of as imperialism by narrative. And here's another example of what I mean. 2 years ago, a group of Chinese exchange students lodged a protest against a sculpture at the London School of Economics. So the sculpture was a globe, but it was oriented so the North Pole was at the bottom and Antarctica was at the top. And it was called The World Turns Upside Down, or The World Turned Upside Down. And the Chinese students were upset because the sculpture showed that Taiwan and China were separate countries. And they wanted it repainted to indicate Taiwan as a part of the People's Republic of China. And the London School of Economics met with the students and they agreed to repaint the sculpture. So Taiwanese groups sprung into action, filing a petition with thousands of signatures. The Taiwan's Minister of Foreign Affairs posted an open letter asserting Taiwan is a sovereign democratic country, not part of any other. And the president of Taiwan, who is a graduate of the London School of Economics, spoke up as well. And she said, "We are a sovereign, independent country. We won't disappear on the surface of the earth." So when I'm constructing a story, I'm considering 2 layers in the storytelling: the narrator and the focalizer. The narrator is who speaks. The focalizer is who sees, through whose eyes the story is filtered. In a news article, it's easy to determine who narrates. You just look at the byline, but it can be harder to suss out who is the focalizer. And then when you start to look carefully and do a close reading and look at particular words, something emerges. So for years, Beijing has been asserting its claim on Taiwan through seemingly quote unquote minor gestures of pressuring corporations and organizations to list Taiwan as a province of China on their documents and websites. You see this a lot with airlines. Another example is when Taiwanese novelist Wu Mingyi was longlisted for the Booker Prize. The Booker organization listed his nationality as Taiwan, China. Or in the case of the Olympics, Taiwanese athletes have to compete under a totally invented flag for a place called Chinese Taipei. And journalists make similar mistakes. In the New Yorker, a piece by Evan Osnos, who is their China expert, about the Trump call, he said, some background, this is quote, some background, Taiwan broke away from mainland China in 1949, and the 2 sides exist in a tense equilibrium governed by decades of diplomatic agreements that serve to prevent war in Asia. I mean, not only is this totally false, but the implication here, I believe, is that the natural next step with quote unquote breaking away would be quote unquote reunification, which delegitimizes Taiwan's autonomy and democracy, and not to mention its history. So taken all together, these assertions are an attempt to impose Beijing's views on independent organizations around the world, and organizations that accept these changes legitimize the claim of the PRC that's not shared by the people of democratic Taiwan. So when we call a country a province or a concentration camp in Xinjiang a vocational training center or an asylum seeker, quote unquote, alien, we're complicit in perpetuating a fictional narrative of history. And it also represents an alarming willingness to forego facts in favor of appeasing the loudest, most forceful voice. And I've seen, like in Western media, being careless with their language, they help further this narrative. And though it may not be the narrator, the PRC is the focalizer. And that's what I mean by imperialism by narrative. So as a novelist, the most effective gesture of activism that I could do, I felt, was to put forth a narrative of Taiwan as itself, to let it emerge from the shadow of the US and China. So I want to offer some other possible narratives of Taiwan. Taiwan for Taiwan's sake, as a multicultural Pacific island with a strong indigenous history, maybe shifting the focus away from Chinese diaspora and out of the Sinosphere. Taiwan as post-colonial space, Taiwan as post-authoritarian space, Taiwan as liberal democracy, Taiwan as resilience, because despite its very painful history, it has transformed itself. It has freedom of the press, universal health care, democratically elected female president. So in closing, I want to put forward this quote from the poet Solmaz Sharif, who in her acceptance speech for her American Book Award, she noted that her parents, who fled the Iranian Revolution, never cautioned her to, quote, watch her mouth before the powerful, even if it might cost her her life, because speaking up is, as she said, quote, better than being dead before we die. I think of those words often. I thought of those words just earlier this week as the Chinese government arrested 50 pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. And the question that my book asks, and that I continue to ask as I look at the legacy of imperialism regarding Taiwan, is, at what cost do we accept the stories of those more powerful than us? Thank you.
My apologies. Hi, I'm back. Thank you so much. And sorry, my computer was lagging a little bit there. But again, I want to thank you, Akemi and Shauna, for offering these really important perspectives. And I think you really effectively brought home the point about the importance of the narrative, how we choose to frame and shape and carry on those stories, whether it's through through the printed text, or even just merely through, talking with family, talking with people about the stories that get passed down. And I'm thinking about, I for sure have relatives that were touched by the Pacific War, and it's really important to capture those narratives when we can. So I wanted to now invite all of us to go into more of an in-depth conversation, and thank you to those of you who already started to send over some questions to us. And I wanted to make sure to address those first so that we are within our time. So the first one is to Akemi, and then I think it's also something that we can extend. Are you still unable to? I saw a comment that you can't see me. Are you able to see me? Oh no. I wonder why. Okay, I'm gonna try to turn off, and I will turn my video back on and see if that will help. Am I visible now? I hope. Hmm. Is my audio?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
So
Okay, in that case, let's go with my voice. We will go with my voice. I'm able to see myself, but I also, if you're able to hear me, we'll work with that. Thank you, technology. So my first question, maybe Akemi, you'd be a great one to start off, is do you have recommendations on what US citizens or those of us residing in the US can do to support the cause for demilitarization as specific to Okinawa? But I think we can also extend it to, how can we support these efforts for independence, for, changing that dominant narrative without having like a savior-like complex or feel? Do you have thoughts on
yeah,
that?
that's a great question. And I think, we have a lot we can do as US citizens because these are our bases, right, that are around the world. There's as many as 1,000 US military bases around the world. And I think a lot of Americans aren't even aware of that or think about that very much. So I think just by starting that dialogue, thinking about it, a great book is called Base Nation by David Vine. And thinking about, do these bases make us safer? Do they make other people safer? Are they worth the, billions of dollars that spent on them? How do they affect local communities? So you can start thinking about that, learning about that, writing to your representatives, advocating from the US side. I think that's not happening much at all. So that's something that we as Americans can do to, join Okinawans in their fight.
And I wanted to also extend it to Shauna because you were mentioning, still where, Taiwan does have to compete or battle with this dominant narrative about, being part of China. And I was just struck by what you were saying about them having to fly at the Olympics, like Chinese Taipei flag, which is, it sounds like something from fiction, but it's not. And so would you expand, or would you say similar efforts to raise awareness would be effective for those efforts as well?
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned, speaking up or noting it or sending letters to the editor when you see things like that. There was pushback against, the Booker Prize Foundation when they had listed the writer's nation of origin as China, and they ultimately they didn't change his listing. What they did was they changed the category to like provinces / nations, so it could be kind of like in this in-between space. But I think, speaking up and pushing back whenever people can is always useful.
Thank you. And just to follow up, since we are talking about Taiwan, there was a question about, are there still US military bases in Taiwan? Were there bases?
There are not, but the US, of course, funds a lot of the weapons that Taiwan has. They sell weapons to Taiwan to protect them from China.
Mm-hmm. And then for you, Akemi, there was a question of if you're familiar with how many indigenous Okinawan languages are there, and if they're still spoken with like fluent speakers. Do you know about that?
Mm-hmm. I don't know the exact number. I want to say there were maybe a dozen or so in the past, and now maybe there's like a handful left, and they're definitely dying out as those older generations pass away. But there are younger people that I met in Okinawa who are trying to revive those languages and keep them alive. So there is a movement towards that. But there was really strict policies instituted by the Japanese government where they, in schools, if kids were caught speaking their native language, they had to like wear a sign of shame. And then the only way they could get rid of that sign was catching someone else speaking the language, and then they could pass the sign to that person. So, policies like that really killed a lot of their languages.
Mm-hmm. It's like reminds me of like the push for assimilation, and it all comes back to like reinforcing that narrative. I feel that that one narrative. And of course, it's not as simple as that. There's another question about, similarly for Taiwan, are there, how many indigenous languages remain there, and whether, are they spoken widely? How is that looking like in Taiwan?
Yeah, there are, a number of Taiwanese indigenous groups. Like I said, 16 that are officially recognized, but there are more than that that are unofficial. And, they each have their languages, not widely, not any official languages, but there is an attempt to, keep those languages alive. And sorry, was there a second part of the question? I think there's about 500,000, don't directly quote me, but I think there's 500,000 indigenous people in Taiwan. And so
Okay,
percentages broken up among that.
great, thank you. And oh, there was also a follow-up question too. I believe, Shauna, you were talking about the London school with the globe, and someone was wondering if the London school ended up repainting the globe.
They didn't repaint it, but there is an asterisk and a little like note or plaque explaining kind of the situation and the school's position on it.
Oh, okay. So they were able to add some kind of addendum note. And another comment we had is, I've heard the Okinawans originally migrated from Taiwan. Is this true? And a question about relations to the Ainu, which are in Hokkaido.
I don't know exactly. I would imagine that, hundreds of years ago, people were mixing in that area. As Shauna mentioned, it's only 400 miles right between Taiwan and Okinawa. So I would imagine that people are mixing there. And as I mentioned, Okinawan, Ryukyu and people were traders. So they were moving all around this region. I'm sure there was mixing there too, and in periods before that. So I don't know exactly, who came from where, but I think there was a lot of movement in that area. And you can see how close Okinawa and Taiwan are.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense since they are geographically quite close. So I wanted to maybe dive in a little bit deeper about, both of you spoke to really the power of narrative and how we're seeing, individuals really become agents of change in terms of trying to tell the narrative, like tell their stories. And specifically, we are really focusing on like the perspectives of women in terms of telling these narratives. And I wanted to maybe revisit that in terms of like, why is it, do you feel there's a particular importance or effectiveness in terms of taking the perspective of women in terms of like retelling or trying to change dominant narratives around these countries?
I'll go ahead. So, I think in thinking about dominant narratives, I think if Americans think about Asian women and the US military, there's kind of a few like stereotypes that probably just come to mind, like Madame Butterfly and the, me love you long time sex worker. And, I think these are kind of the popular images of Asian women in Asia and around the US military, right? And this is from the perspective of American soldiers. So, part of what I wanted to do was really spend time with women outside of these US military bases in Okinawa and figure out what is their story and tell their diverse stories and try to talk to a wide array of women and show their actual reality from their own perspectives and not from the male military gaze. And it was also important to me because even in Okinawa, I saw that women's voices were being marginalized, even in the anti-base movement. There's one prominent female activist, Suzuyo Takato, who told me that she had this experience of male activists saying to her, why are you talking about women's issues all the time? Those are separate. And so she was really working to make people understand that these are human rights issues, not just women's rights, and that, women are at the center of this story, and women are so affected by these spaces, and we need to center their voices instead of marginalize them. So I was thinking about all of that.
Yeah, that's something I really appreciate about your book, Akemi. Like for me, growing up as a mixed race Asian woman whose dad was in the military, I had to deal with that kind of narrative about who my mother was and what kind of person she must have been. And, that was definitely not the reality I was seeing. So I like that you are also putting forth that these women have agency, that it's not like the Madame Butterfly story. And I think in going back to the main question about why centering women's stories, as I was writing this talk, I was thinking, imperialism by narrative, but a lot of like these systems that we're living under come through narrative. So patriarchy by narrative, right? And so when you're doing that, you're pushing it back against that patriarchal narrative, which is kind of like the water we live in.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those the thoughts, as you were writing your books. And related to that, how do you think your positionality as Americans affected your research or writing as you were going through this?
Going back to imperialism, I think I had to think about the fact that even though, as an Asian American woman writing this, I still was an American, and that gives me a certain amount of privilege and puts me in a certain, position. And so I think being conscious of the kind of privilege I was bringing to the book, and maybe the unconscious biases I had as an American that I was carrying around. So I think, and when I've talked to people who are not American about the book, they're calling that attention. They're like, you're bringing that too. And that was something that's even less visible to me than all the other parts of my identity, the Americanness, and what part that plays. So it's something I've grown to be more aware of. And I think that it gained me some kinds of access in writing the book, and I have to acknowledge that.
Yes, thank you. And we got a comment from Ben that I will read out, that there have been currents of pro-Trump support in Taiwan on the notion of his stances against China. And he's curious to hear, Shauna, your thoughts on this trend viewed against the story under imperialism and power. And then Akemi, if you've noticed any similar currents playing out in the context of Okinawa and Japan.
Yeah, that's a good question. Even in the last few days, there have been some protests in Taiwan supporting Trump and what's happening, and it is mind-boggling and really frustrating. But I think people are seeing it as I'm trying to be like the empathetic novelist, and what are people thinking? But I think that they feel like Taiwan is between a rock and a hard place, and it's like their backs are up against the wall with China, and then you see what's happening with Hong Kong, and then China puts out these like battle videos of like what invasion of Taiwan will look like, these sort of like video game like videos, and things like that. So they're looking at Trump on one issue, and they see, well, Trump is strong against China, and that's what we need. And I'm assuming that's where it's coming from.
My experience with Trump in Okinawa was that I was there right after he got elected, and it was interesting because some of the anti-base protesters were excited about that because he has said, that Japan doesn't pay enough for the military bases, which, Japan pays a ton of money for U.S. military bases, but kind of implying that that the U.S. should withdraw bases from Japan unless they pay more, right? So Okinawan activists in this kind of ironic situation were excited about Trump in some respects, and hopeful that maybe he would change the dynamic there. I mean, that didn't happen, but I saw the same thing after Obama was elected. I was there too when he was elected, and people got excited thinking that he was going to do something different about the base situation, and he didn't. So I've heard this last election that they were not excited. They didn't, by now they don't expect any change really with the administration. It's been the status quo for so long.
Yeah, thank you for responding to those comments, and thank you, Ben, for that observation. I think it's really interesting to see, because like, since speaking from my experience, just being, you know, residing in the US, and we're just surrounded by a very US centric context, when we look at, yeah, like government level policies and politics and Trump, and like, it's always really interesting to see how it plays out in external affairs, and how it's, yeah, it's different related to, again, like the narrative, right? That Trump communicated and other elected officials communicate.
Yeah.
And we only have, just in the last few minutes, I did want to squeeze in one more question, because I feel like, you know, in addition to both of your publications, I wanted to see if you came across any great resources, or other great, you know, organizations or other resources that might be great if people want to dive in a little more, you know, learn more about the context and the post-war history for Taiwan and Okinawa.
I can cut and paste some links into the chat box. I did earlier, but I'll repaste them that have book lists if people want to read more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of really great academic works about Okinawa, but, you know, they can be, you know, kind of challenging for general readers. So there's a couple novels I wanted to mention. In the Woods of Memory by Shun Meroruma. He's an Okinawan writer, and that was recently translated into English, and it deals with, you know, sexual assault by U.S. military and the Battle of Okinawa and the legacy of all of that through the generations. Another novel is Above the East China Sea by Sarah Bird, and that also deals with some of these same similar themes and topics in a novel form. And then I want to mention there's a memoir coming out next month called Speak Okinawa by Elizabeth Miki Brina, and I haven't read it yet, but she is the daughter of a U.S. serviceman and Okinawan woman, and I think it kind of chronicles her parents' story in Okinawa and hers, and so I'm excited to read that one.
All right, thank you so much. We are wrapping up towards the end of the hour, and that just flew by for me. I don't know about the rest of you listening in, but just wanted to again reiterate, please, you know, we will post the links again so that you can access Akemi and Shauna's wonderful books here to really dive into all of the great research and effort that went into their creations. So please, by all means, support our local authors so that we can continue to share out these narratives that very much need to be told and need to be spread more. And quick apologies that the tech hiccup froze me, but at least it's froze me in a smiling face. So I hope that with that, I wanted to thank you all again for attending today's event to help kick off our programs for this year. And we hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Hope that you can find places to recharge and to stay connected. So with that, I would like to bid you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Akemi Johnson. Thank you, Shawna Yang Ryan, for sharing your stories with us today. And we will see you all next time. Thank you so much, everyone.